They say every man has a price, but as I looked into Julian's cold obsidian eyes across the length of my own conference table, I realized he wasn't here to buy my company. He was here to see me break. "One signature, Ethan," he whispered, leaning so close I could smell the expensive sandalwood and rain on his coat. "One signature, and the war is over." I didn't flinch. I just smiled. Because what he didn't know was that while he was playing a game of stocks, I was playing a game of hearts, and I was about to make the most dangerous move of my life. Let me take you back 3 hours. The city had been swallowed whole by the kind of rain that doesn't ask permission. It came down in heavy, deliberate sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 52nd floor, drumming a rhythm that felt almost funereal. My office, Coal Industries' crown jewel, designed for authority and adorned with the kind of silence that makes lesser men uncomfortable, was lit only by the amber glow of the desk lamp and the pale blue flicker of the news broadcast on the wall-mounted screen. I wasn't watching it. I didn't need to. Titan Corp has completed its acquisition of Meridian Financial, the third local firm to fall under the conglomerate's expanding portfolio this quarter. Industry analysts warn that the Asian-Pacific giant shows no signs of slowing its aggressive expansion into domestic markets. 2 firms remain as potential targets: Julian Cross's Crosstech Ventures and... I reached over and turned it off. The silence that followed was not comforting. It was the silence of a storm holding its breath before the second strike. I sat at my desk, the leather of my chair cool against the back of my carefully pressed suit jacket, and I looked at the document in front of me, a final notice of hostile acquisition intent. 22 pages of legal language engineered to sound like a mercy and deliver a death sentence. They wanted my servers, my patents, my client base, and my people. 1,400 employees, engineers, developers, architects of innovation who had believed in this company before it had a name worth believing in. My fingers did not tremble when I picked it up. That has never been my way. I read it as I read every document that arrived with the intention of dismantling something I had built, with cold, surgical clarity. I found the traps. I found the escape clauses. And I found the window. Narrow, almost surgical in its specificity, a provision buried in the local merger defense statutes that Titan Corp's international legal team had evidently missed or dismissed as irrelevant. They would learn that nothing in this city is irrelevant when it's protecting itself. But I couldn't exploit it alone. That was the brutal arithmetic of my evening. I needed Crosstech. I needed Julian Cross. And that was the part that made the rain feel personal. He didn't knock. That was the first thing. In 5 years of institutional war, proxy battles, patent disputes, poached executives, and one particularly spectacular media campaign I had orchestrated that resulted in Julian's picture appearing next to the phrase "cutthroat capitalism" in 4 separate national publications, Julian Cross had never once walked through a door I had not opened for him. He walked through mine at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, rain-damp and devastating in a charcoal overcoat, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the weather in a way that his perfectly composed face refused to acknowledge. He carried no briefcase, no folder, no paper, just himself, and the kind of eyes that looked at a room and immediately calculated its exits. His gaze found me in exactly 2 seconds. I counted. "They're coming for me next, Ethan." His voice was low, private, designed not to carry beyond the 2 of us. "We either die separately or survive together." I set down the acquisition notice. I leaned back in my chair. I let the silence stretch just long enough to remind him that in this room, I was not the subordinate. "That's the most words you've ever said to me without a lawyer present," I replied. Something moved across his face. Not amusement. Julian Cross did not do amusement as a rule, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that I was, as I had always been, not easily rattled. He crossed the room without invitation. He pulled out the chair across from mine without asking. He sat down, unbuttoned his overcoat, and folded his hands on the table with the practiced composure of a man who had been making boardrooms feel like chess matches since his late 20s. He said, "I assume you've seen the Meridian acquisition." "I've seen the last three. Meridian, Praxis Solutions, Sterling and Webb. I've been watching Titan Corp's trajectory since Q2. He studied me. "And you have a plan?" It was not a question. "I have the beginning of one," I said, "but it requires something I've spent the better part of a decade trying to avoid." "Cooperation," he said. The word sounded clinical in his mouth, like a medical procedure. "Specifically," I said, "with you." The rain intensified against the glass. Neither of us moved. I should explain something about Julian Cross, because the narrative that the industry had built around him and that I had, in certain strategic moments, happily reinforced, was not entirely complete. Yes, he was sharp. Yes, he was relentless. Yes, he had once restructured an entire mid-cap firm over a single weekend and emerged Monday morning looking like he'd simply taken a pleasant vacation. The man was a machine, and the machine was elegant. But machines, in my experience, have one fatal vulnerability. They are built to process, and some things cannot be processed, only felt. I hadn't known in those early years of our rivalry whether Julian Cross was capable of feeling anything at all. Tonight, for the first time, I was beginning to wonder if I'd been wrong. Outside my office, in the low-lit waiting area that our respective assistants had turned into something resembling a demilitarized zone, the night was passing in a very different register. Mark to Leo. "Your boss let my boss in without security. Should I be worried he's planning a murder? Because Julian definitely looks capable of murder tonight." Leo to Mark. "Ethan doesn't need to resort to murder. He has lawyers. Also, if your boss touches anything on Ethan's desk without permission, we're going to have a much bigger problem than Titan Corp." Mark to Leo. "He sat down in the guest chair, voluntarily. In 5 years, Julian has never sat voluntarily in anyone else's office. He usually makes them come to him. I'm genuinely unsettled, Leo." Leo to Mark. "Good. Stay unsettled. It keeps you humble. Also, stop watching through the glass. You look like a raccoon pressed against a dumpster." Mark to Leo. "I'm observing. There's a difference." "Your boss is smiling." Leo to Mark. "Ethan smiles strategically. It means he has the upper hand. Your boss should be nervous." Mark to Leo. "Julian doesn't get nervous." "Julian looks nervous." The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. For years, Julian and I had been the titans of this industry, two stars locked in a collision course, each waiting for the other to burn out. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The air didn't just crackle with our usual animosity, it was thick with the scent of a common ending. Beyond these glass walls, a shadow was looming. Titan Corp. They were a faceless conglomerate from across the ocean, a giant that didn't care about legacy or innovation, only absorption. They had already picked off our smaller rivals, and now we were the only two left standing on the map. I spread the relevant documents across the table between us. I didn't narrate them, I waited for him to read. Julian Cross was not the kind of man you talk through a document. He consumed information the way most people consumed oxygen, rapidly, completely, without ceremony. He read. 3 minutes of silence. The rain kept its own counsel. Then he looked up. "The mutual defense provision," he said. "Section 14C of the local corporate merger statutes," I confirmed. "If two firms of combined qualifying assets merge under a domestic defense trust before a foreign acquisition notice is formally filed with the Commerce Board, the acquiring party cannot proceed without majority shareholder approval from the merged entity. Titan Corp filed their intent against me. They haven't filed against TechBank yet." "Meaning," he said slowly, "if we merge before they file..." I said. "They need 60% of our combined shares to proceed. We don't have it. They can't get it. The window closes in 72 hours." Julian was quiet. It was a different quality of quiet than the silence at the beginning of the evening. This was the quiet of a mind building architecture at speed. I recognized it because I had done the same thing 3 hours ago, when I had first seen the provision, and I had sat in this same chair with this same rushing electric feeling of possibility unfolding inside a crisis. "You've already drafted the preliminary framework," he said. "Of course. You've already run the projections? Naturally. You came to this meeting knowing what you were going to propose." I held his gaze. "Julian, I come to every meeting knowing what I'm going to propose." Something shifted in the room. It was subtle, the way weather shifts before lightning, a change in pressure rather than temperature. He looked at me differently then, not with the cold calculation that was his default register, but with something more complex, something I couldn't immediately categorize, and I was a man who prided himself on categorizing everything. "This is still a merger. My name goes on a document next to yours. Your name has been next to mine in every industry ranking for 5 years. This time, we simply stop competing over which one comes first. I've never operated as part of a dual structure. Neither have I." I paused. "But I've also never had a foreign conglomerate attempt to absorb 1,400 of my people's livelihoods. Context," I said mildly, "does shape one's flexibility." He stood up. I watched him cross to the window. He stood there, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the rain-blurred city below. The lights blurred and smeared by the downpour into something almost impressionistic. He was a precise man, standing in a blurred landscape. There was something in that image that I filed away in the part of myself that noticed things I didn't yet have words for. "You know what bothers me most about this?" he said, without turning. "Tell me." "That you're right." The words sounded like they cost him something. "I don't lose sleep over competition. I've never lost sleep over a rival, Ethan, not once in this industry. But I've run the Titan Corp numbers for 3 weeks. He turned to face me, and there it was, the thing I hadn't been able to categorize. Behind the obsidian composure, behind the architecture of control that Julian Cross wore the way other men wore armor, a flicker of something unguarded, something that might, in a lesser man, be called fear. I've run them 17 different ways, and every single model ends the same." "We lose," I said. "Separately," he said. The space between us felt suddenly different, not smaller. We were still on opposite sides of that table, but different in quality, like the air itself had revised its position on the nature of our relationship. "Then we don't do it separately," I said. He walked back to the table. He didn't sit. He stood at the edge of it, one hand resting on the surface, leaning just slightly, close enough that I registered with irritating clarity the precise details of him. The way the lamplight carved shadows into the planes of his face, the faint imperfection of a scar along his left jawline from something that had happened years before I'd known his name. The way his eyes, which I had always cataloged as cold, were not cold at all at this proximity. They were deep, which was an entirely different quality, and I found myself suddenly very focused on maintaining the particular brand of composed authority that I was known for. "I have conditions," he said. "So do I," said. "Equal footing, no silent partner arrangement." "Agreed." "Shared communications approval on all public-facing statements. Within reason. Board representation, 50-50, non-negotiable. And," he said, and his voice dropped a register that I chose to attribute to the late hour and the gravity of the situation, "you stop planting stories in the financial press that make me sound like a Bond villain." I considered this. "I'll reduce the frequency," I said. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely, the ghost of something that might have become a smile if it had been given permission. And then the argument started, as it always did with us, Not from malice, but from the sheer accumulated friction of two people who had spent years in opposition, whose instincts were trained to clash. It began over the precise language of the initial framework document, moved through the question of office primacy, escalated into a pointed exchange about the original patent dispute that had ignited our rivalry 3 years prior, and arrived eventually at the moment where Julian said the words that I would later acknowledge privately had been the catalyst for everything that followed. "You are too emotional to run a war, Ethan." The room went very still. I stood up slowly. The spine of steel that my employees whispered about held itself perfectly true, as it always did. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "And you," I said, with the quiet precision of someone who has measured every word before placing it, "are a machine wearing a suit and calling it strategy. You don't make decisions, you calculate them. And the difference matters, because calculation without courage is just mathematics dressed up as leadership." His jaw set. I watched the muscle in it tighten. "I have led Crosstech through. I know your record. I've studied it more carefully than anyone alive. I know every acquisition, every restructure, every quarter where you over-delivered and every quarter where you cut losses and called it optimization. I know your company the way you know mine, because for 5 years, knowing you was a matter of survival." I paused. "But knowing a machine and understanding a man are different exercises, Julian. And right now, what we need isn't calculation. It's conviction." He crossed the distance between us. I had not anticipated that. Julian Cross, in all our years of professional warfare, had never moved toward me with anything other than legal paperwork. But he crossed the room in 3 deliberate strides, and he stopped, not at a professional distance, not at the calculated remove of a rival, but close. Close in the way that rewrites the vocabulary of a room. His hand reached for my shoulder. I think his intention had been the frustrated, punctuating grip of a man making a final argument, the physical equivalent of a period at the end of a sentence. But I didn't move. I held his gaze with the calm of a man who has spent his entire career refusing to be the one who blinks first. And the grip that had come with the intent of punctuation paused at the moment of contact, and the room held its breath. And the rain fell against the windows like it was trying to tell us something. And Julian Cross, architect of exits, master of composure, the coldest man in any room he'd ever entered, looked at me with those deep, not cold eyes, and forgot his sentence entirely. The breathing between us was audible in that silence. Mine. His. The 7.4 centimeters that separated us from one reality to another collapsed. And he kissed me. Or I kissed him. Or, as I have come to understand it, turning the moment over in my hands in the weeks that followed, we kissed each other in the way that 2 forces of equal mass and velocity create a collision that cannot be attributed to either particle alone. It was not soft. It was not polite. It was not the exploratory uncertainty of a beginning. It was the release of 5 years of pressure, all that friction, all that competition, all that carefully maintained opposition finding its truest, most honest form. A storm meeting the shore, 2 stars in the collision course we had been locked in for years, finally arriving at their destination. When it ended, and it ended as abruptly as it had begun, both of us stepping back by a precise and mutual half-step, we were different people standing in the same room. Julian's tie was fractionally crooked. I became aware of this with the same hyper-clarity that accompanies adrenaline. He looked at me. I looked at him. "The merger framework," he said after a moment. "We'll need to finalize the language," I agreed. "Tonight." "Tonight," I confirmed. Neither of us mentioned what had just happened. Neither of us moved to leave. Outside in the waiting area, a sound like 2 people scrambling away from a door. I am not going to speculate. I am a professional. I am simply going to note that my boss's tie is crooked, and I have never seen Julian's tie crooked. In 5 years, not once, not even at the Christmas gala where someone spilled champagne on him directly. Don't say anything. I'm not saying anything. Good. I'm just saying that if the war is over, someone should probably tell the server room to stop the scheduled midnight data wipe I set up for your client database. Mark. I'll cancel it. I'll cancel it. Does this mean I have to start being nice to you? Don't push it. I leaned back in my chair as Julian settled across from me again. His tie readjusted, his composure rebuilt in the way that a craftsman returns to a project, deliberately, with attention. He opened the preliminary framework document. He uncapped his pen. "Section 1, he said. "Section 1, I echoed. And the rain fell, and the city blurred beyond the glass, and somewhere in the distance, Titan Corp was counting what it believed to be 2 isolated targets. They were going to be so surprised. The Harrington Foundation's annual Innovation Summit was the kind of event where every handshake was a negotiation and every smile concealed a shareholder vote. It took place at the Meridian Grand, a name that carried, this particular season, a fresh layer of dark irony, given that Meridian Financial had been Titan Corp's most recent meal. The venue's ballroom had been dressed in white and gold, with orchestral strings threading through the ambient din of 200 of the city's most powerful people pretending they were at a party rather than a battlefield. I arrived precisely on time, not a minute early. Early conveyed eagerness, not a minute late. Late at this specific event, with these specific people in this specific moment of our industry's history, conveyed vulnerability. I arrived at 7:30 p.m. in a graphite suit that my tailor had spent 4 hours perfecting, with the particular expression I reserved for rooms where I needed everyone to see exactly what I wanted them to see. Composed authority, quiet confidence, the untroubled face of a man with nothing to hide. I had a great deal to hide. 48 hours had passed since the midnight meeting, since the documents, since the argument that had taken the temperature of the room from cold professional hostility to something so charged that it had altered the molecular composition of the air between us, since the moment that my meticulous, strategic mind, trained over 15 years of corporate warfare to process everything as data, had encountered an input it could not immediately classify, and instead simply responded. The kiss was not something I had analyzed, not yet. That was deliberate. I am not a man who interrogates things before I understand them well enough to interrogate usefully, and I did not yet understand this well enough. What I understood was the strategic reality. Julian Cross and I had 42 hours remaining before Titan Corp's filing window aligned with the Commerce Board schedule, and the preliminary merger framework needed 17 more hours of legal review before it was ready to sign. What I understood was that the alliance was the priority, that the 72-hour window was the clock, and that whatever had shifted in the geography of my relationship with Julian Cross would need to exist in the same space as the work until the work was done. I am very good at compartmentalization. It is perhaps my most reliable skill. I crossed the ballroom's threshold, took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray — alcohol at industry events was an amateur's concession — and began the evening's performance. I did not look for Julian immediately. That was the arrangement we had agreed to in the hour before dawn on Wednesday when we had finally set down the preliminary documents and acknowledged, wordlessly, that we both needed 3 hours of sleep and a great deal of professional distance before we appeared in public together. The arrangement was this. We arrive separately. We acknowledge each other, if at all, with the civil frost of longtime rivals at a neutral event. We give Titan Corp's people, and they would have people here, they always did, the kind of sleek corporate emissaries who arrived at industry galas as intelligence assets rather than guests, absolutely no reason to revise their current understanding of the coal-cross dynamic. The coal-cross dynamic, as far as the industry understood it, was mutually assured destruction on legs. We needed to preserve that perception for exactly 42 more hours. I worked the room with precision. I spoke to the Harrington Foundation's chair about innovation grants. I spent 8 deliberate minutes with the head of the city's Commerce Board, the very man whose signature would eventually matter enormously, discussing pleasantly and completely irrelevantly the Foundation's urban development initiatives. I smiled at the right people. I held measured positions on careful topics. And I was acutely, unignorably aware of exactly where Julian was in the room at every moment, the way you were aware of a storm system on the edge of the horizon, not looking directly at it, but tracking it in your peripheral vision with the attentive instinct of someone who has learned that weather changes fast. He was talking to the Harrington Foundation's investment director. He had the kind of posture that made rooms pay attention. Not performed, simply native, the carriage of a man who had never needed to announce himself. His dark suit was immaculate. His profile, in the warm light of the ballroom, was architectural. I looked away. He had already been looking at me. I knew because I had been tracking, peripherally, and his attention had shifted in the half-second before mine did. This was the first coded message of the evening. Mark, to Leo. Report from the west side of the ballroom. Julian has been standing 3 degrees off from facing your boss's general direction for the last 40 minutes. He's talking to Hartley, but he hasn't actually heard a word Hartley said in approximately 20 minutes. Hartley doesn't know this because Julian is nodding at perfect intervals. Where did you even get a protractor? I estimated. I have an eye for this. Also, your boss just adjusted his cufflinks for the 3rd time in an hour. Ethan doesn't fidget. He literally does not physically fidget. I've worked for him for 4 years. I have never seen him touch his cufflinks twice in a single evening. He's just making sure his presentation is... He's not presenting anything tonight, Leo. There is no presentation. He is standing at a gala, adjusting his cufflinks and pretending he is not looking at my boss. Has Julian done anything weird tonight? Specifically weird? Because Ethan acting slightly less than robotically perfect is a very low bar for evidence. Julian smiled. Not the cold one he uses when he's winning something. The other one. What other one? I didn't know there was another one either. That's how I know something has happened, Leo. What did your boss do to my boss? The second coded message happened at 8:47 p.m. I was crossing from the east side of the ballroom to the presentation area, navigating the standard obstacle course of handshakes and brief exchanges when Julian's trajectory and mine arrived at the same point in space at precisely the same moment, as I had calculated they would, having tracked both his movement and mine for the past 20 minutes with the kind of unhurried precision that my assistants would have found alarming if they'd known what they were watching. We stopped. 2 to 3 feet of professional space between us, close enough to be civil, far enough to be cold. Mr. Cross, I said. Mr. Cole, he said. The industry protocol for 2 known rivals at a public event is a brief, neutral exchange. Industry people were watching. I registered at least 4 separate sets of eyes orienting in our direction with the focused interest of people who had learned that Cole-Cross interactions were worth monitoring. Titan Corp's observer, a woman in a pale blue dress whom I had identified in the first 12 minutes of the evening, was in my peripheral vision. Julian extended his hand. A shake, standard, unremarkable. I took it. His grip was firm, my grip was firm. Neither of us increased pressure, neither of us released first. What happened in the space of that handshake was imperceptible to every observer in the room. What happened was this. His thumb moved. A single, controlled motion so precisely calibrated and so brief that it registered as nothing. A handshake settling, a grip adjusting, but which landed on the precise point on the inside of my wrist where my pulse lived, and held there for exactly 1 second. I maintained my expression with the iron discipline of a man who had spent 15 years training his face to be an instrument of strategy rather than an instrument of feeling. I met his eyes with the measured cool of a public rival. "Good to see you keeping the foundation in order," I said, pleasantly. "Always," he said. The word carried more weight than it should have given the content. We separated. 30 seconds of interaction. The industry observers relaxed and returned to their conversations. I walked to the bar, set down my untouched sparkling water, and picked up a fresh one. My pulse took slightly longer than 30 seconds to return to its baseline. The coded touches continued throughout the evening, so subtle that I began to feel something approaching impressed admiration, not an easy thing for me to feel about Julian Cross, given that I had spent 5 years finding his methods predictable. But this was improvisation on a level I hadn't anticipated. At the dinner seating, we were placed 4 chairs apart. The foundation knew better than to seat us adjacent. But when Julian reached past a mutual acquaintance to retrieve the salt shaker, his arm crossed my eyeline with the deliberate slowness of a calligrapher signing a significant document. At the dessert course, when I mentioned in a broader table conversation that I had always found architectural symmetry more interesting than ornamentation, Julian looked up from across the table and said, "Some of the most structurally sound designs appear on the surface entirely without pattern." He was talking, ostensibly, about a building project someone had referenced. No one at the table had any reason to find this remarkable. I did not smile. I considered the underside of my dessert fork with the same attention I'd have given a legal document, and I said, "The pattern is only visible to those who haven't looked long enough." Julian's expression did not change. He returned to his dessert. Under the table, my fingers unclenched from where they'd gripped my knee and returned to a resting position. Okay, I put something in Julian's coffee this morning, but it was just an extra shot of espresso because he looked like he hadn't slept, and now he's smiling at the dinner table like a person who knows what happiness is. Did the coffee unlock something? Leo, am I a miracle worker? You are going to give me a heart attack. He's smiling. Julian doesn't smile at galas. He evaluates. He strategizes. He makes other billionaires feel like they're being quietly audited. He does not smile. It's not the coffee, Mark. Then what is it? I think your boss is happy. Is that dangerous? For Titan Corp, absolutely. It was 10:15 p.m. when the event began its natural deceleration. Speeches concluded, orchestra shifting to something more ambient, the crowd thinning as the first departures created permission for the rest. I had done what I'd come to do. I had been seen, I had been composed, I had given Titan Court's observer absolutely nothing to revise in her intelligence report, except perhaps a footnote about the exchange with Julian, which I expected she would read as the usual cool professional hostility. I found a moment of space near the eastern balcony doors and was reviewing the evening's variables when Julian appeared beside me, not from the direction I'd been tracking, which meant he'd deliberately approached from my blind side, which meant he'd been watching my position longer than I'd realized. "You're working," he said. "I'm always working," I said. "So am I." A pause. We're getting close to the 72-hour mark. 14 hours, I confirmed, voice low. The legal review finishes at noon. We can sign by 2. Titan Corp's filing schedule. I've been monitoring it. They won't move before end of business tomorrow. They're expecting to hear from their intermediary tonight about the status of negotiations. I looked at him sidelong. They'll hear that negotiations are tense, that there's no clear path to resolution, that both firms appear to be dug in. Because? Because that's exactly what Leah will be telling their intermediary's assistant when she calls at midnight. Julian was quiet for a moment. You briefed your assistant. Leo knows what to say, enough to be convincing, not enough to be dangerous. And you trust him. Completely, the way I presume you trust Mark. A brief expression crossed Julian's face. Mark requires management, he said, but yes, he's loyal. Then they'll do their parts, and by 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon we sign, and the window closes, and Titan Corp will be filing against a target that no longer exists in the form they expected. Julian turned to look at me fully. We were side by side, facing the balcony doors, the rain-slicked city visible through the glass, and I had, again with that irritating, unclassifiable clarity, the precise sensory awareness of the 6 inches between us. The warmth of him in the cool air near the doors, the quiet that existed in the small private geography that had formed between us across the last 48 hours, distinct from the 50-year industry gala happening behind us. You know, he said, voice quieter than the room required, 5 years ago, if someone had told me that Ethan Cole's plan to save his company would involve trusting me, I don't trust you yet. I trust the math. I trust the merger framework. I trust the provision. A beat, you'll have to earn the rest. He looked at me with those deep, not cold eyes, and something moved across them that I was, by now, beginning to develop a vocabulary for. Not yet certain of the vocabulary, but the words were forming. "Fair," he said. In the reflection of the balcony doors, I watched the woman in the pale blue dress make her way toward the exit, a phone to her ear. Titan Corp's observer was reporting in. I hoped she was telling them exactly what we needed her to believe. "Leo to Mark." She called. I was perfectly confused and stressed, just like we discussed. Told her that the meeting Tuesday was a disaster and both CEOs refused to negotiate. She bought it. Julian told me to do the same with their guy Price. I told Price that Julian called Ethan a sentimental liability. Price actually laughed. It was insulting. Ethan is going to make a note of that, just so you know. Julian didn't mean it. He was making stuff up. I know. Ethan knows. We're professionals. Relax, Mark. I'm relaxed. I'm perfectly relaxed. Leo? What? Julian hummed on the way to the car tonight. Hummed? Like a person who is in a good mood, quietly. He didn't know I was listening. I have worked for Julian Cross for 5 years, and he has never hummed. Go home, Mark. I'm going. I'm just saying. Your boss did something to mine, and I don't know whether to be scared or grateful. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's the big day. Right, tomorrow. He really hummed, though. In the car on the way back from the gala, I did something I rarely do. I sat in the back of the car, the rain tracking across the windows in crooked silver lines, the city moving past in its blurred nighttime colors, and I let myself think about Julian Cross in a way that was not strategic. I thought about the handshake, the thumb, the precise, controlled placement of a single point of pressure that had been designed to communicate something in a room full of observers who couldn't see it. I thought about the building symmetry conversation, the architectural code of it, the way two people who had spent 5 years reading each other as opponents had discovered, almost accidentally, that they read each other very well. I thought about 48 hours prior, about an argument that had escalated past its own logic into something truer, about the 7.4 centimeters, about the collision. I am not a sentimental man. Julian had called me that in the heat of the argument, and he had been wrong. Sentimentality is the indulgence of emotion without the architecture of purpose, and everything I feel has always had purpose. But I am capable of honesty in private, in the back seat of a car in the rain, and so I allowed myself the honest acknowledgement that something had shifted in the center of my chest during those 48 hours. Something that had been still for a very long time. Something that had the particular quality of the beginning of a thing I could not yet fully name, but which had, like the merger framework, revealed itself with the timing of a crisis. Some things cannot be processed, only felt. I thought of Julian's voice saying that. No, not saying that. I had said that, about him. About the difference between calculation and conviction. Perhaps the same was true in the other direction. Tomorrow we would sign. Tomorrow the window would close and the clock would run out on Titan Corp's assumptions and the next phase would begin. A phase that would require the kind of sustained, close collaboration that our rivalry had, for 5 years, made structurally impossible. I was not, I decided, dreading it. That was information. The car turned toward home through the wet city streets, and I allowed myself to note the information, file it in the appropriate space, and look at the rain, and let the space where Julian's thumb had found my pulse keep its quiet warmth for just a few minutes more before I returned to strategy. The merger would save the company. The rest, I was beginning to understand, was going to save something else. The thing about a performance designed for an audience is that it only works if you're not too good at it. It was now week 3 of what Leo had taken to calling, in his private texts, the arrangement, and Julian and I had settled into the double architecture of our situation with a kind of practiced fluency that made me aware, occasionally, in the quiet moments between strategy calls, of how instinctively we had begun to read each other. Publicly, we were at loggerheads. Every statement from Coal Industries regarding Crosstech was measured, civil, and pointedly competitive. Every statement from Crosstech regarding Coal Industries was the same. On the industry level, the coal-cross rivalry was alive, well, and apparently intensifying. 3 separate financial publications had noted the escalating tension, which was exactly what we needed Titan Corp to believe. Privately, Julian had a standing 8 p.m. call with me every night that Leo and Mark had begun to reference simply as the debrief, in the same tone they might reference a standing geological phenomenon, unavoidable, unexplainable, simply there. The sabotage strategy was Julian's architecture, which I respected. It was elegant. Rather than actively opposing Titan Corp, we fed them intelligence, carefully curated intelligence, delivered through the channels they'd established for monitoring both our firms. Intelligence that painted a picture of 2 companies too internally fractured by their rivalry to pose any unified resistance. Julian had mapped their information network with the precision of a man who had been watching it for weeks, because he had been, separately, before our alliance, and he'd brought the map to our second working session like a gift. This is their primary source. He'd slid a document across what had become, organically, our shared workspace, the corner office in Crosstech, that faced the city. We'd rotated venues every 2 days, a precaution that had become, without either of us formally noting it, simply the geography of how we worked together now. Mid-level analyst, junior to their strategy director. She's been positioned in the city for 8 weeks. The woman in the pale blue dress, I said. He looked at me. From the gala, I clarified. I identified her in the first 12 minutes. Something crossed his face. I had begun to catalog these expressions with the same careful attention I had once devoted to cataloging his business strategy, and this one, I had come to understand, was the expression he made when I did something that confirmed an opinion he was still in the process of forming. "Of course you did," he said. And then, because we were 3 weeks into an arrangement that had fundamentally altered the terms of everything between us, he said it without the edge that sentence would have carried 5 years ago, or 5 weeks ago. He said it like it was simply true, and he simply found it worth noting. The feeding of intelligence was progressing. Titan Corp believed that Julian and I were on the verge of a catastrophic public break, a rift so severe that one of us would be willing to negotiate separately. This was Phase 1 of what we had privately titled the Trojan Merger. Phase 2 was the part that required their analysts to carry the right story at the right moment, which was where Leo and Mark came in. Neither of them knew the full scope of what they were carrying. They knew enough to be convincing, enough to be correct about the parts Titan Corp would verify. But the critical element of the story, the piece that would misdirect Titan Corp's legal team at the moment they needed misdirecting most, was embedded in their separate accounts in a way that neither Leo nor Mark could access independently. It required them to talk to each other. This, as it turned out, was creating some operational complexity. I am going to be very professional about this. That's never a good opener, Mark. I think our bosses are in there right now in Julian's office not doing work. They are absolutely doing work. I just got a strategy document timestamped from Ethan's system at 9:47 p.m. Okay, but the document was titled Framework Cross-Coal Amendment 7B. That's just the merger document update. Leo, I looked at the metadata. Amendment 7B was last modified for 12 minutes before the timestamp auto-saved it. 12 minutes of a 2-hour working session. Maybe they were talking through the section before writing it. I timed how long it takes Julian to talk through a legal document section. Average 90 seconds. He doesn't deliberate, he decides. Okay, so what's your theory, investigative journalist? My theory is that the working late situation has evolved, and I am too professionally loyal to my employer to say anything else. Same. Same. So we're agreed. We don't know anything. We know nothing. We are professional assistants who respect the privacy of our employers. Exactly. Leo. What? Julian brought lilies to the office this morning, a whole arrangement. He told the front desk they were for ambiance. Julian Cross does not do ambiance. Correct. Ethan's favorite flowers are lilies. I know, Leo, I know. The stakeout was their idea. I found out about it on a Thursday when Leo arrived at my morning briefing with the specific expression he wears when he has information he's not certain he should have. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I want to be transparent that last night Mark and I may have, in the interest of professional due diligence, positioned ourselves in the Crosstech parking structure in order to—" "What time did you arrive?" I said. A pause. 7:45 p.m. "And when did you leave?" 11:30. He said with the quiet dignity of a man accepting consequences. "And what," I said, "did your due diligence establish?" "That both company cars were present until 11:22 p.m., he said, "and that your office light on the 44th floor went off at 11:24. He folded his hands in his lap. "And that I owe Mark $12 because he bet you'd be out before 11 and I said midnight." I looked at my assistant for a long moment. "Leo?" "Sir." "You are the best professional assistant I have ever employed," I said. "You are also, when your instincts engage, approximately impossible to deceive. You understand that?" "I do," he said, a little carefully. "Whatever you and Mark have concluded, I needed to stay between the two of you for 6 more days. After that," I paused. "After that, the situation will be more transparent." Leo nodded once with the composure of a man storing information for future use. "Of course, Mr. Cole." He stood to leave. "And Leo." "Sir?" "Tell Mark," I said, "if he's going to run a stakeout, he should avoid the parking structure on the east side. The security camera on level 3 has a rotation gap every 12 minutes. He was standing directly in its sightline during the gap." Leo's composure cracked briefly into something that was almost a smile. "I'll let him know." The moment the falling happened, and I should be precise because it is imprecise to say it was a single moment, it was an accumulation of moments that reached on a Thursday evening in the 32nd day of our arrangement, a kind of tipping point, was not dramatic. No storm meeting the shore. No collision of stars. It was this. Julian and I had been working on the final piece of Phase 2, the component that would trigger Titan Corp's strategic overreach at the exact moment we needed them overextended. The room was quiet in the way it had become quiet over the past weeks, a working quiet, not the weighted silence of two rivals calculating each other's vulnerabilities, but the comfortable, focused quiet of two people who had found a rhythm. I was reviewing the document. Julian was at the secondary desk, building the timeline for the information release sequence. He said, without looking up, "You changed the language in Section 9. I said, "It was cleaner." He said, "It was your language, not our language." I looked up. He was still not looking at me, focused on his screen. The lamp threw warm light across the side of his face, the architectural precision of it, the scar along his jaw, the lilies on the corner table, the quiet. "I'll revise it," I said. "No," he said. He did look up then. "I want you to explain the change. The word you used was partnership instead of alliance. Those aren't interchangeable." "They're not," I agreed. "An alliance is transactional. A partnership implies—" He paused. "It implies a different kind of investment." The room held the quality it had developed over 32 days of late evenings, something private and careful and warm in the way of a thing that has been given time to grow. "I know what it implies," I said. Julian Cross, who had spent his entire career being the most precise man in any room, put down his pen. He looked at me across the distance of that office. Not great. We had unconsciously gravitated closer together over the weeks until our working positions were no longer at opposite ends of the table, but at adjacent corners of the same table. And for the first time in 32 days, neither of us reached for the architecture of strategy to fill the space between us. "Ethan," he said. My name and his voice had a different quality than it did in other contexts. I had started noticing this approximately 27 days ago and had been cataloging it with the dedicated internal attention of someone who knows they are gathering important data and is not yet certain what the data will be used for. I was beginning to understand what it would be used for. The filing, he said, is in 6 days. 5 days and 14 hours, I said. And after that, he said, the structure changes. We're not two firms with an alliance. We're a merged entity with co-leadership. He paused. That's a different kind of proximity, Ethan. Structurally, professionally. Another pause, smaller. And in other definitions. I'm aware, I said. Are you comfortable with that? It was, I realized, the most careful question Julian Cross had ever asked me. In 5 years of rivalry and 32 days of alliance, I had never heard him ask anything carefully. He asked precisely, he asked strategically, he asked with the confident forward momentum of a man who expected the answers to arrive in forms he had already accounted for. This was careful. This was the question of someone who was uncertain about the answer and was willing to be uncertain about it. Julian Cross, uncertain. That was the moment the falling completed itself. Not with drama, with the quiet, irrefutable certainty of something that has been in progress for weeks and simply, finally, arrived at its destination. Julian, I said. I use the word partnership because it's accurate. The word alliance describes what we were 32 days ago. I held his gaze with the same steady composure I had held his gaze on the night he had walked through my door in the rain and changed the definition of everything. I'm not interested in what we were 32 days ago. The working quiet settled around that statement and held it. Julian reached across the corner of our shared table and turned the Section 9 document so it faced him. He uncapped his pen. Partnership is accurate, he said. He did not look up, but the corner of his mouth made the movement I had come to recognize, the ghost that would become a smile if it was given permission, and this time, this specific Thursday evening with the lilies on the corner table and the city blurred with rain beyond the glass, I gave it permission. It became a smile. Julian Cross smiled privately in the quiet of our shared office space, and I understood that I was thoroughly, irrevocably, and with considerable strategic disadvantage in the situation of falling for my former rival, my current partner, and the most infuriating, precise, and unexpectedly extraordinary man I had ever gone to war with. 6 days, I thought. 6 days, and then the next part begins. Stakeout update, level 3 west side. I have learned from my mistakes. Mark, go home. Ethan's office light is on at 10 p.m. and I can see 2 silhouettes at the corner table and they are very close together. That's just the lamp positioning. One silhouette just handed the other silhouette something. The other silhouette is looking at it. The first silhouette is smiling, Leo. How can you see a smile from a parking structure? I have binoculars. Why do you have binoculars at work? Because I am a thorough professional, Leo. Put the binoculars away and go home and do not tell me anything else. He's still smiling, Leo. Good night, Mark. Good night. We're definitely going to have to start getting along, aren't we? I was thinking drinks on Friday if this all works out. If the bosses are buying, I'm in. The morning of the hearing, I stood at the window of my office, the 52nd floor, the same rain-slicked glass, the city stretched below in the gray clarity of early November, and I thought about the shape of things. 43 days. That was how long a rivalry became an alliance. An alliance became a partnership, and a partnership became the most quietly transformative thing that had happened to me in 15 years of building an identity around the proposition that I didn't need anyone at the table to survive. The Titan Corp hearing was scheduled at 10 a.m. Their legal team had arrived in the city the previous evening, 4 senior attorneys, 2 strategy directors, and a representative from their Pacific division who had the specific brand of confidence that comes from having successfully absorbed 47 firms in 11 months. They expected this morning to be a formality. They expected to arrive at the Commerce Board hearing room, present their documentation, and walk away with Ethan Cole's signature on a transaction that would dissolve coal industries within 60 days. They expected this because up until 48 hours ago, their intelligence indicated that Julian Cross had agreed to support their acquisition, that in the final collapse of the Cole-Cross alliance, Julian had chosen pragmatic self-preservation over solidarity, and was prepared to testify that the proposed merger between our firms had failed, clearing the path for Titan Corp to proceed unopposed. Their intelligence was exquisitely wrong. Julian and I had spent the 48 hours before the hearing in the most productive working session of our alliance, which was, by this point, also the most effortless. We had the legal team running the Mutual Defense Trust documentation through final review while we worked in parallel on the procedural sequencing. What would be said, in what order, by whom, with which documents on the table. We had pre-briefed the Commerce Board's Administrative Counsel, a woman named Patricia Chen who had, upon reviewing our documentation 4 days prior, looked at both of us over the rims of her glasses with an expression that suggested she was not entirely surprised that Ethan Cole and Julian Cross had found a way to turn a hostile takeover attempt into a structural innovation. The trust provisions are valid, unprecedented in application at this scale, but the statute is clear. Precedent, Julian had said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who enjoys being the first to do something, is simply history waiting to be written. Patricia Chen had looked at him, and then at me, and then back at her documents. "I'll see you both Thursday morning," she had said. The hearing room at the Commerce Board was designed to be impressive without being intimate, a space for declarations, not conversations, long table, high windows, the kind of light that made everything feel consequential. Titan Corp's team was already seated when Julian and I walked in together, and the specific quality of their composure, the settled, confident ease of people who believe the outcome is predetermined, shifted subtly in the first 2 seconds after they registered what they were seeing. 2 people, walking in together. I watched the strategy director's eyes move from Julian to me to the distance between us and recalibrate. Julian held the door for no one. He was simply the last person through it and let it close behind him with a precise, unhurried click. He crossed to the table. He sat beside me, not across from me, beside me, in the configuration we had agreed upon 3 days prior and which communicated without a word the precise revision to everything Titan Corp had been told to expect. Their lead attorney, a man named Reeves, who had the kind of practiced urbanity that comes from spending a career in rooms like this, recovered quickly. He was good, I noted that objectively. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I understand the last few weeks have been challenging. We're prepared to make this process as streamlined as possible." "I appreciate that, Mr. Reeves," I said. I set my leather portfolio on the table. I did not open it yet. "Before we begin, I'd like to ensure we're all working from the same understanding of the current landscape." Reeves glanced at Julian. Julian was looking at his own documentation with the focused stillness of a man reviewing something he is already committed to memory but is verifying out of precision. He did not acknowledge Reeves's glance. "Of course," Reeves said, returning to me, "though I think the landscape is fairly clear. Cole Industries' independent filing window closed. The proposed cross-merger with Crosstech failed," said Julian without looking up, "publicly." Reeves paused. "Yes, so we're here today to finalize the acquisition of—" "Mr. Reeves," I said, and I opened my portfolio. I slid a document across the table. Not the acquisition agreement they had prepared. A different document, its cover page bearing 2 corporate seals pressed side by side on a single page. The Cole-Cross Mutual Defense Trust was filed with the Commerce Board 41 hours ago. Full registration, complete asset disclosure, joint board documentation. I let the words land with the weight I had been measuring them for precisely this moment. Under Section 14C of the local corporate merger statutes, which your international legal team appears to have evaluated as inapplicable, the combined entity of Cole Industries and Crosstech Ventures constitutes a qualified domestic defense merger. In order to proceed with any acquisition of either firm, Titan Corp would require majority shareholder approval from the merged entity. I let the document breathe on the table. "You don't have 60%, I said. You can't get 60%. The share structure of the trust was specifically designed to ensure that arithmetic. Reeves was reading. The strategy director beside him was already on her phone. The Pacific Division representative had stopped looking confident and had started looking at the documents with the expression of someone doing rapid, unpleasant mathematics. "Your public fallout," Julian said, setting down his own documents and finally looking across the table with the unhurried composure of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment. The public fallout was a performance. The media coverage of our failed merger was the smokescreen. While your team was interpreting our public statements as confirmation that we were divided, we were filing. He paused. "We're very good at what we do, Mr. Reeves. It would have been worth noting that earlier." Reeves set the document down. His composure was admirable. I gave him that. "This will require review," he said, carefully. "Of course," I said. "You have the right to review. Patricia Chen's office has copies of the complete filing and will make legal counsel available to answer procedural questions." I gathered my own documents with the efficiency of a man closing a meeting that has reached its conclusion. "You'll find, upon review, that the filing is airtight. We had very good lawyers." I paused. "And a great deal of motivation." The silence in the room was of a different quality now. Not the held breath of anticipation, the exhale of a calculation that had arrived at its final number, and the number was wrong. Julian stood. He straightened his jacket, a gesture I had catalogued over 43 days and understood now as the physical mark of a decision fully made, a posture settling into its final form. He looked at the Titan Corp team across the table with the particular quality of attention that I had once experienced as his opponent and now witnessed as something close to an ally, the absolute, untroubled clarity of a man who does not doubt his own arithmetic. "You're welcome to review the documentation, but I'd suggest doing so from your hotel." He looked at the Pacific Division representative, then at Reeves, then at the strategy director with the phone. "You're banned from both buildings. If you need the address of your hotel, security can assist." He placed his hand on my shoulder. It was, by any external measure, a professional gesture. The hand of a co-signatory standing with his partner at the conclusion of a significant filing. Witnesses in the room would read it that way, and they would not be wrong. But it was also, and this was not for the witnesses, this was for the private architecture of everything that had been built over 43 days, the public repetition of the private. The first time his hand had been on my shoulder, we had been alone in a room with heavy oak doors and the beginning of something. This time, we were in a hearing room with witnesses and Titan Corp's retreating team and the beginning of a different kind of something. The same warmth, the same steadiness, the same quiet certainty of a hand that had learned the precise geography of that shoulder and remembered it. They left. Not immediately. There were procedural courtesies and some clipped exchanges about review timelines and their legal team's prerogatives, but they left. Reeves shook no one's hand. The strategy director was still on her phone. The Pacific Division representative gave the document one last look, the look of someone memorizing the architecture of a defeat, and then they were filing out, and the door was closing, and Patricia Chen's assistant was collecting the filing copies, and the room was quiet. Julian's hand had left my shoulder. We were standing at the table with the particular stillness of the aftermath of a thing, and it was, I should note this precisely, the first time in 43 days that the stillness between us didn't contain the weight of strategy or urgency or the calculated management of timing. It was just stillness, clean and earned. Julian turned to look at me. The architecture of his face had done the thing it had been doing, increasingly, in the private geography of our working hours, the thing where the composure didn't drop exactly, but became something else, became less of a tool and more of a fact. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he has stopped pretending not to value. "Was that," he said, "poetic enough for you?" It was the line I had used in the second week of our arrangement during an argument about communication strategy. I had told him that the public narrative needed to be more than just accurate. It needed to have the quality of a story that people believed in their bones. And he had asked, with characteristic precision, what I meant by poetic, and I had said, with equal precision, "You'll know it when it works." He had been right to throw it back. I felt, and this is what I mean when I say I am not a sentimental man, but I am an honest one, a warmth in my chest that had been growing for 43 days and had arrived in this quiet aftermath of a boardroom that had just witnessed the end of an acquisition attempt and the beginning of a co-empire at a fullness I didn't have a strategic category for, only a human one. I smiled, not the smile I use in rooms like this, not the composed, measured, weaponized version. The real one. The one that my employees had never seen, that I had kept in the private file of myself for 15 years of building armor and calling it professionalism. Julian Cross had made me use the real one 3 times now. I had stopped being surprised by it. It was a start, I said. The afternoon was quiet in the way that follows the resolution of something large. Julian and I returned to what was now, formally and legally, the shared headquarters of the Cross Trust, the 52nd floor of my building, which would serve as the primary office while Crosstech's 54th floor handled the East Division operations, an arrangement that had been Julian's suggestion and which I had accepted with the specific kind of equanimity that comes from no longer having to pretend you don't want someone nearby. We didn't debrief immediately. There was, by mutual and wordless agreement, a moratorium on strategy for the first hour. We sat, the leather chairs angled toward the window, the city visible now in the afternoon light, the rain having finally relented, with coffee that Leo had produced with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned to read the atmospheric conditions of a room and respond accordingly. Julian had his coat off. That was the detail I noticed. The overcoat on the chair instead of worn, which was Julian without his armor, which had become, over 43 days, one of the visual registers of our private space. "We have a board meeting Monday," he said, after a while. "I know. The integration timeline is going to be complicated," I said. "Yes, we'll manage it." He was quiet. Then, Cross Trust is unwieldy as a name. Cross? I said. He considered this. Also unwieldy. "We have the weekend," I said. Outside, the city was doing what cities do after a storm, asserting itself, all traffic and light and the business of continuation. We had 4,200 employees between us who would be coming to work on Monday morning under a new banner, with new organizational charts and new reporting structures and the particular energy of a company that had survived something. Julian set his coffee down. He turned to look at me with an expression that had no precedent in our rivalry. Open, in the way I'd only seen glimpses of, the way the deep, not cold eyes looked when he had decided something and wasn't managing the decision, just holding it. "I want you to know that I'm aware of what this is." "Are you?" I said. "I'm not a man who—" He paused, the precise man searching for precision. "I don't do things halfway. That's always been true professionally. I want it to be on record, in this room, right now, that it's also true in the other definitions." He held my gaze with the same steadiness with which he had held the boardroom, the gala, the 43 days. Whatever the architecture of this ends up looking like, I'm not treating it as a secondary consideration. The warm afternoon light fell across the planes of his face. The city moved beyond the glass. The lilies, he had transferred them from the Crosstech office, a gesture so understated that I had filed it under evidence in the ongoing internal case had been building for the past 6 weeks, stood in the corner of my office now, white and deliberate. I am, as established, not a sentimental man. I am a man who builds things carefully and values what he has built. 15 years of architecture, professional, personal, the long work of becoming the person who does not bend under pressure, who holds the line, who signs nothing that costs him his integrity. Julian Cross was not asking me to bend. He had never asked me to bend. He had sat across from me in a crisis and said, "Survive together," and meant it in every applicable register, and had spent 43 days proving he meant it by showing up, consistently, with the full force of who he was. That is not a small thing. In my experience, that is the rarest thing. "Julian," I said. "Yes. I'm also not treating it as a secondary consideration." The afternoon light shifted. The city asserted itself below. Two stars that had been on a collision course for 5 years had collided, and the collision, it turned out, had not destroyed either of them. It had made something new. Something with the combined mass and brightness of both. Something that Titan Corp and every firm like them was going to learn in the quarters ahead to account for. Julian reached over and picked up his coffee. He handed me mine. We sat in the chairs that faced the window, close in the way that had become our natural distance, and looked at the city we had just, in a very real and structural sense, protected. "Monday," he said. "Monday," I agreed. A beat of quiet. Then, because I had always been strategic, even in my most human moments, "The name," I said. "What about Nexus?" Julian considered. Nexus. Nexus Industries. Clean, forward-facing, doesn't prioritize either legacy. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It works." He looked me sidelong. "You had that ready." "I had 3 options ready," I admitted. Nexus was the second one. "What was the first?" "Something I discarded." "And the third?" "Something I'm holding in reserve in case you reject the first 2 at a board meeting." He turned to look at me fully, and there it was, the smile. Not the ghost of it, but the real one. The one I'd seen 3 times now, and which remained on each occasion the most unexpectedly disarming thing I had ever witnessed on the face of a man I'd once catalogued as a machine in a suit. "You," he said, with the certainty of a man who has finished a calculation, "are going to make every board meeting very interesting." "I thought that was already established," I said. It was. A pause. "I find I don't mind." "Leo?" "I know." "We did it." "We did nothing. They did it. We handed out coffee and coordinated information leaks." "I feel like we played a significant supporting role." "We absolutely did. I'm just not going to tell Ethan that because his ego doesn't need the contribution." "Julian's ego doesn't need it either. He'll be absolutely insufferable on the Monday morning briefing." "We won." Like it was a sentence. Like that's all that needs to be said. 3 words. I'm going to have to prepare a 30-slide deck, and he's going to say, "We won," and consider it covered. That's accurate and also somehow charming now that he's in a good mood. Are we getting along? Let's not catastrophize. We coordinated a corporate espionage operation together. We ran a stakeout together. We're on the same side now. Professionally, institutionally, our bosses are Mark. Co-CEOs. Yes. So we're going to be seeing each other every day. That is the current structural arrangement, yes. And we have to cooperate. Professionally, within appropriate limits. Leo, I think we might actually have to be friends. Don't romanticize it. I'm just saying, the evidence is fairly conclusive. I guess we're on the same team now. Drinks are on your boss. Julian will call it a client entertainment expense and expense it to the company. As long as someone's paying. Friday, 7 p.m., the bar on the corner between our old offices. That bar is equidistant from both buildings. I know. That's almost symbolic. Don't push it. I'm not. I'm being professional. See you Friday, Leo. See you Friday, Mark. Evening fell on the city, the way evening falls after a long-held season finally breaks, with the particular quality of light that belongs to endings that are also beginnings. The 52nd floor held us, as it had held us through 43 days of strategy and proximity, and the slow, inexorable accumulation of something that had always been larger than the work, even when the work was what we told ourselves was the point. Julian stood to leave at 7, and I walked him to the door, which was, I recognized, a gesture I hadn't made with anyone in a long time. And in the doorway, with the low amber light of the office behind us and the quiet of the empty floor ahead, he turned. No boardroom, no audience, no strategy. Just the 2 of us in a doorway at the end of a day that had changed the shape of everything. Thursday morning, he said. First board meeting of the Nexus era. I'll have the amended governance framework. I'll have the integration timeline. Good. Julian, my name in that particular register. Yes, I said. Thank you, he said, simply. The two words without architecture around them. No calculation, no precision, just the honest, undressed weight of a man who means what he says. I had spent 15 years building an identity around the proposition that I didn't need anyone. The spine of steel, the composed authority, the man who walked into every room having already calculated the exit. I had built it carefully, and I had been proud of it, and it had, in every meaningful sense, served me. But standing in that doorway with Julian Cross looking at me with those deep, not cold eyes, and the last of the day's light in the room behind us, I found that what I wanted, with the clear, simple honesty of a man who has stopped managing his own feelings in order to process them faster, was to revise the proposition. Not to abandon it. The spine of steel would remain. The composure would remain. The strategic mind and the 15 years of architecture would remain. They were mine. They were true. But the proposition needed a footnote. The survival was mutual, I said. That was always the math. He smiled. The real one. The one that had disarmed me 3 times and was now, technically, doing it a 4th. He left. The elevator doors closed. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the quiet hallway, the city beyond the windows, the version of this floor that had been mine alone for 15 years and was now the beginning of something that had 2 names on the door and a board meeting Thursday morning, and a name to put on it, and a bar Friday evening, and more than I'd started with, considerably more. I went back to my desk. I picked up my phone. I sent one text. Nexus. Nexus? Good night, Ethan. Good night, Ethan. The city continued its business below. The rain stayed away. Somewhere across the skyline in the cross-tech penthouse that had become our shared territory as naturally as everything else had, Julian Cross was probably already reviewing the governance framework. Being precise, being thorough, humming maybe in the quiet of an office that no longer felt like an outpost of a rival. I sat at my desk. I looked at the lilies in the corner. My lilies, which had arrived in my office in a gesture so deliberate and so understated that I had filed it carefully in the ongoing case and had known by that Wednesday morning exactly what the verdict was going to be. I opened the governance framework. I began to work. Outside the glass, the city rebuilt itself after the rain, as cities always do, finding the pattern in the aftermath, the structure in the resolution, the shape of the thing that remains when the storm has passed and the stars have stopped colliding and become, instead, the fixed points by which everything else navigates. Somewhere in the Commerce Board's files, the Nexus Mutual Defense Trust was now a matter of record. Somewhere across the skyline, Julian Cross was reviewing documents and probably already drafting his first proposed amendment to the governance framework, which I would debate with him Thursday morning with the comfortable, fluent, and thoroughly indecent pleasure of a man who has found the one person worth arguing with. And in the quiet of the 52nd floor, Ethan Cole, composed, architectural, the man with the spine of steel and the real smile he'd been keeping in reserve, went back to building something. This time, he wasn't building it alone. The end.